Hello, I'm Andie Sophia Fontaine, the editor at Iceland Review, filling in for Yelena, and this is Iceland News Review. Today we're going to talk about a future eruption, a daring rescue at sea, puffin protection, and much more. Has finally come to an end last weekend after 24 days of activity. For those who are not keeping score, this makes the 8th eruption on the Reykjanes Peninsula of southwest Iceland since 2021 and the 5th since last December. Now, even as this eruption was dying, there was still risk from lava flow of lava that had already come out of the eruption. And in fact, lava had gotten as close as 1 kilometer away from the Svartsengi power plant, which provides electricity to some 30,000 residents in the Reykjanes Peninsula. The way they were able to combat this, right, was not just to use bulldozers to build earthen dams to keep the lava back, but they also used a trick that harkens back to 1973, the Hema eruption in the Westman Islands. That is, they used fire trucks and sprayed water onto the lava to cool it quickly, and it worked. Now, as we've covered extensively at Iceland Review, the town of Grindavik, which is home to some 3,600 people on the Reykjanes Peninsula, has been the most threatened by the eruptions and the subsequent earthquakes. There's been extensive infrastructure damage to the town. Lava caught fire to a couple of structures there as well. And so you would think that with the end of this eruption, that everyone can breathe a sigh of relief and move back home. Unfortunately, that's not the case because there's already land rising that's being seen in the Svartsengi area where previous eruptions had occurred. Now, land rising typically indicates magma accumulation, and scientists now believe that magma is accumulating into this chamber beneath Svartsengi at a rate of 4 to 6 cubic meters per second. As such, they believe that there should be a new eruption within the next 3 to 6 weeks. But of course, with all kinds of earth sciences, it can be a little inexact. It's impossible to say for certain, like you can't put a precise date on when these things happen. But our scientists are monitoring the situation closely, and we will, of course, keep you updated with the latest information as it arises. So Iceland may be known for its tourism industry, but we shouldn't forget that this country was built on the fishing industry, an industry that is very much still thriving today, as evidenced by all the ships and boats behind me. It's a very lucrative job, but it's also a pretty dangerous one at times, as evidenced last Tuesday when rescue workers were called out to a fishing boat in Faxaflói Bay, which is the bay that surrounds Reykjavik. A helicopter and 3 rescue boats were dispatched to the scene, receiving a distress call. This was a concerted effort by rescue workers from 3 different municipalities, Reykjavik, Hafnarfjörður, and Kópavogur, who arrived on the scene of this boat at around 11 p.m., and they managed to seal up the leak that was in the boat and determined that the crewman was semi-conscious and needed to be taken to hospital, where he was immediately for treatment. Well, they don't really know exactly what caused his condition. They did say it was a close call. The ship was also rescued and was towed into Hafnarfjörður. So as you see, our rescue workers and the Icelandic Coast Guard are there pretty much for any sort of situation, whether there's somebody that was trapped on a mountain, or there's a volcanic event, or also there's been an accident at sea. Not that they're very frequent, mind you. In fact, due to the passage of the Fishermen's Accident Prevention School in 1985, they've decreased dramatically. And of course, all of our fishermen are well trained in the operations of what they're supposed to do when they're at sea. But even with the best training, accidents can still happen. And it's very fortunate that we have safeguards in place to help rescue people in need. If there's a single animal that is iconic to Iceland, it's probably the puffin. When you visit this country, if you don't get a chance to go out in the countryside and go on a puffin sightseeing tour, you will see plenty of stuffed puffins in downtown Reykjavik. However, what you might not know is the puffin is in danger. The Ministry for the Environment and the Environmental Protection Agency of Iceland have recently urged hunters and restaurateurs to cut back on hunting and selling puffin meat because their population has been drastically declining. So let's take a look at the numbers. Iceland has the world's largest population of breeding puffins, with some 20% of the global population in the Westman Islands alone. And there are some 3 million nesting pairs across the country. However, a study published last year, Iceland's puffin population has declined by a staggering 70%. That's 70% since 1995. Now, to be clear, hunting only accounts for 10% of this population decline. The rest of it is various other factors, including decline in the fish stocks that the puffins feed on due to global warming. Their conservation status right now has been vulnerable since 2015, and Eruption Hansen of the South Iceland Nature Center has been strongly encouraging the government to do more than just ask restaurateurs and hunters to reduce the hunting and sale of puffin meat. So I would also ask you, if you visit Iceland and you see puffin on the menu at a restaurant, don't order it. You can go on tours to see these beautiful birds flying around in nature, and barring that, you can always buy a souvenir featuring a puffin, and believe me, there's lots of those. Yzan Tamimi is an 11-year-old boy from Palestine. He is disabled with Duchenne muscular dystrophy and has to use a wheelchair. Immigration authorities in Iceland had slated to deport him and his family at the end of July, but that has been delayed until the beginning of August. Numerous children's rights and disability rights groups have pointed out that his deportation is possibly and probably in violation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. So why is he being deported? This goes back to what's called the Dublin Regulation. Now, this is an international treaty wherein signatory countries have the right, but importantly, not the obligation, to send asylum seekers back to their previous point of departure. In this particular case, Yzan's family came from Palestine to Iceland via Spain, and that is where immigration authorities want to deport him to. Now, Yzan and his family don't know anybody in Spain. They have nowhere to stay, no prospects there at all. And the family's lawyer, Albert Björn Ludvigsson, has been trying to get immigration authorities to reconsider his case and get him to stay here. In fact, doctors have said that this trip could be life-threatening for him even, and would definitely interrupt his treatment, necessary treatment, I might add, for up to 18 months. So if you're a regular user of the bus system, such as myself, you're probably very cognizant of when there are fare hikes. And guess what? There's been another one. To take a single adult fare in the capital area will now cost 650 Icelandic kronur. This marks the second time Strætó has raised their fares so far this year. At the end of 2023, a single adult fare cost 570 kronur. At the beginning of this year, that was raised to 630, and this entails a 14% increase in just over 6 months, double that of inflation. Now, as someone who rides the bus, cognizant of these fare hikes, you're probably asking yourself, why? Are they doing some new and amazing thing with the buses? Well, the CEO of Strætó, Jóhannes Gunnarsson, says that the fares are due to wages, because the wages that they pay, not just their drivers, but also administrators and operators, account for 50 to 60% of Strætó's total operational costs. And as there's been a wage increase, that's being passed on to us. So Iceland has a multi-party system within their parliament, and some parties are very, very old, some parties relatively new, and some parties are almost always around. One of them is the Independence Party. This is a party that has been a part of pretty much every government with very few exceptions. And right now, new polls from the group Maskina show that they are at a record low of 14.7%, which is historically very low for this party. So why is this important? Well, the Independence Party is one of 3 parties in Iceland's ruling coalition. That would be the Independence Party, of course, the Left Greens, and the Progressive Party. Now, the Left Greens used to lead the government, but former Prime Minister Katrín Jakobsdóttir stepped down from her position in order to run for president of Iceland. While she very narrowly lost that election, Bjarni Benediktsson replaced her as the prime minister. The party that is currently polling highest are Samfylking, which is a social democratic party, and they're at 27%. Now, with all the other parties that are currently in parliament, it's pretty much their game right now. Elections are to be held in 2025, barring unforeseen circumstances. And what I mean by that is that we have had emergency elections before, very recently, in fact. You might remember in 2016, the Panama Papers scandal. At that time, then Prime Minister Sigmundur Davíð Gunnlaugsson, who was the chair of the Progressive Party, was forced to resign in disgrace. Then we had emergency elections, and we had a new government, and that collapsed a year later due to scandals that I don't have the time to get into right now. But hopefully we'll have like a regular voting term, and in the fall of or spring or whenever in 2025 we'll have new elections in Parliament, and if these poll numbers hold out for the Social Democrats, they'll pretty much have their pick of the litter in terms of who they want to form a coalition with to be able to have a majority of Iceland's Parliament's 63 seats. So if you visited Iceland, you are probably very much aware that it's an expensive country to visit, and that's no less the case for those of us who live here. In point of fact, for about 3 years now, we've been battling high inflation and high costs of living. However, there is some good news. The consumer price index has risen by 5.8%, and this marks the first time in about 2.5 years that inflation has been below 6%. Now, just to put that into context, in February of 2023, the inflation rate was 10.2%, which is the highest it had been in recent years. Now, although inflation is trending downward, the costs of some things have been increasing. For example, international airfare rose by 8%, and hotel and restaurant prices increased by 2.1%. It's not too much, but still, you feel it. And this is largely due to a 17% rise in accommodation costs. So fighting inflation is, of course, pretty important for the economy, and there's a lot of tools in the box to be able to do that. One of them is the Central Bank of Iceland, which raises inflation rates in order to combat inflation. The key rate is currently 9.25%, and that's been helping keep inflation down. But there's always a caveat with this. They decided to keep that rate steady in May, despite calls to lower these rates in order to ease pressure on Icelandic households that have mortgages. For many years, cod has been king in Iceland. There's a flag from the 19th century that featured 3 stockfish, that is, cod fillets, on a blue field. That was an unofficial flag of Iceland for a very short time. We fought with the British over cod in the infamous Cod Wars of the 1970s, wherein fishermen and the Icelandic Coast Guard went up against the British Navy and won. It's long been Iceland's #1 fish until very recently, where it's now been replaced with salmon. And just to give you some idea of exactly how lucrative salmon farming is in this country, last year, salmon generated 136 billion ISK for the Icelandic economy. That's roughly $979 million US. It is indeed the boom times for Icelandic salmon. Between 2014 and 2021, production went from 4,000 tons to 45,000 tons. That's a greater than tenfold increase. And when I'm talking about salmon farming, we're talking about fish farms, okay? And in particular, these are what are known as net pens, where you'll see a ring floating on the water, and from this ring is a net which descends into the water, and the salmon are kept there. There's very little overhead to this. It's relatively easy to maintain salmon this way because, of course, the water is always being refreshed. But the downside of this is that it can be polluting. Like if a disease such as like a louse, fish louse, get on the salmon, it spreads very quickly to the rest of them. Furthermore, there's also a danger if the salmon escape from these pens, they can interbreed with other fish. It's not so great for the environment. However, to be fair, not all salmon are farmed in this way. Some are kept in above ground pens. And while this is much more expensive, it's generally healthier for the salmon and for the rest of the fish in the sea. And that's all we have for you today this week on Iceland News Review. Be sure to visit icelandreview.com to check out more coverage of these stories and a lot more. I'm Andie Sophia Fontaine, and I'll see you again very soon.